The auctioneer's gavel had barely touched wood when Dale Pruitt grabbed the microphone right out of his hand. "Hold on now," Dale said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "I just want everyone to witness this. Because 20 years from now, when somebody asks how a Mercer girl threw away her inheritance, we're going to say we were right here." Laughter rolled through the crowd like a wave finding a shore. Lydia Mercer stood 12 feet away, her bid slip still warm in her hand, 15 mules shifting and stomping behind a rusted gate that hadn't been oiled since the last century. She was 24 years old, she had $15 left in her checking account, and every single person at that auction, every rancher, every neighbor, every man who had shaken her grandfather's hand at his funeral just 6 weeks before, was laughing at her. She didn't flinch. She folded the bid slip and put it in her coat pocket. That was the moment everything began. If this story moves something in you, if you've ever been the person standing alone while everyone else laughed, subscribe to this channel right now and follow Lydia's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because some stories, they deserve to go the distance. The Mercer farm had been dying for longer than Lydia had been alive. She knew that even before she drove the 300 miles from Asheville to claim it. She had heard it in her grandfather's voice every time he called her on Sunday evenings. That particular flatness that settles into old men who are watching something they built begin to come apart at the seams. Harlan Mercer never complained directly. That wasn't his way. He would talk about the fence line that needed mending, the creek road that washed out in April, the timber prices that had dropped again. He talked around the problem the way you talk around a tooth that hurts, circling it, acknowledging it, never quite touching the center. Lydia had meant to visit more. She had told herself that every autumn for 5 years. Then the call came on a Thursday morning in late October, and her Uncle Raymond's voice was flat and formal in a way she had never heard before. And she understood before he finished the sentence that Harlan was gone. She sat on the edge of her bed in the apartment she shared with 2 other women and stared at the water stain on the ceiling for a long time. It was shaped, she had always thought, like the state of Tennessee. She had lived beneath it for 3 years and never bothered to tell her landlord. Some things you just learn to work around. The farm came to her in the will with the kind of bluntness that only old men from the mountains can manage. To my granddaughter, Lydia Ann Mercer, who has her grandmother's eyes and more sense than she shows, I leave the Mercer property in full, including all structures, equipment, and mineral rights, on the condition that she attempt to work it for no less than 1 calendar year before any sale may be executed. Her Uncle Raymond called that provision pure Harlan. Her mother called it manipulative. Lydia called it the only interesting thing that had happened to her in 3 years. She gave notice on her lease the following Monday. Her roommates thought she was having some kind of breakdown. Her mother drove 4 hours to sit at her kitchen table and explain, with charts she had drawn by hand on yellow legal paper, why selling the farm immediately was the only financially sensible option. Lydia listened to all of it. She thanked her mother for coming. She finished packing the next morning. What she didn't tell anyone, not her mother, not her roommates, not the 2 coworkers who texted asking if she was okay, was that she had already spent 3 nights reading her grandfather's journals. Harlan Mercer had kept journals for 41 years. 41 thin composition notebooks stacked in a cedar chest at the foot of his bed, the dates written on the spine in his careful, cramped handwriting. Lydia found them the first afternoon she spent at the farm, when she was still walking through the house in her coat because the propane heater needed a part she didn't have yet, cataloging what remained and what was gone. The chest was the only piece of furniture in the bedroom that didn't look exhausted. She opened it, expecting quilts or old photographs. She sat on the cold floor and read until 2 in the morning. What Harlan had written was not poetry. It was not sentimental. It was the working record of a man who spent his life thinking carefully about land, about what land wants, what it can sustain, what it will give back if you treat it as a partner instead of a resource. There were soil observations, rainfall measurements, hand-drawn maps of the creek drainage. There were notes about which sections of the slope could bear weight after rain and which turned treacherous. And buried in the journals from 20 years before, repeated in different forms across a dozen entries, there was something that stopped her cold. The old trail still holds. I have walked it 3 times this year. The mountain has not forgotten, even if the men have. She didn't know what trail he meant, not yet, but she wrote the phrase in the back of her own notebook and kept going. The Clanton County Livestock Auction was held on the first Saturday of every month, in a yard outside a town called Delwood that had exactly one stoplight and a diner that closed at 2 in the afternoon. Lydia arrived at 7 in the morning because she had read, in a farming forum she found at midnight the week before, that the animals nobody wanted were usually run through early before the serious buyers arrived. She was looking for mules. This was not a random decision, though it would look like one to everyone watching. Harlan's journals had mentioned mules 23 times across 4 decades. Not horses, not tractors, mules. Specifically, the capacity of a well-trained mule to navigate steep terrain that would break a machine. Specifically, the way a mule's hoof distributes weight differently than a horse, creating less compaction on root systems. Specifically, a mule's ability to sense unstable ground and refuse to cross it. An instinct that had, according to one entry from 1987, saved Harlan's own life on a slope above the eastern ridge when a logging skidder from the next property over had gone through the same ground 3 days later and taken the operator with it. Lydia had read that entry 4 times. She was not sentimental about animals. She had not grown up with them. She did not arrive at the auction with some romantic notion of rescuing broken creatures. She arrived with a handwritten list of what a working mule required in terms of health, temperament, and basic soundness, compiled from 3 different sources she had found online and cross-referenced against each other. She arrived with a plan, which was more than could be said for most of the decisions she had made in the previous 5 years. What she had not planned for was Dale Pruitt. Dale Pruitt was 53 years old and owned the largest cattle operation in Clanton County. He was the kind of man who took up space intentionally, broad-shouldered, loud-laughed, the first one to a handshake and the last one to leave a room. He had been buying and selling livestock in that yard for 22 years. He knew the auctioneer by his first name and his first wife's first name, and the name of the dog the auctioneer had put down the previous spring. He was, in the social architecture of Delwood, load-bearing. He noticed Lydia because she was writing things down on a clipboard, and nobody at a livestock auction used a clipboard unless they were a vet or a fool. "You Harlan Mercer's girl?" he called across the yard. She looked up. "Granddaughter." Same difference. He walked over without being invited. "You looking to buy something?" "Yes." He looked at her clipboard. She didn't turn it to show him. "What kind of operation you running up there?" "I'm still working that out." He had smiled at that. Not unkindly exactly, but with the particular tolerance that large men in small towns sometimes extend to young women they have already categorized. "Well, if you need any advice, I've been farming this county since before you were born. Your grandfather was a good man. He knew when to ask for help." "I appreciate that," she said. She went back to her clipboard. The mules came through at 7:45. 15 of them, run through as a single lot because the owner, a man from the next county who had inherited them from a dissolved logging operation and wanted them gone in one transaction, had priced them collectively at a number that made them, per animal, worth less than the feed it had taken to keep them alive through the summer. They were thin. Several had rough hooves that needed attention. One had a deep scar across its shoulder from an old harness wound. None of them were young. The auctioneer started the bidding at $250 for the lot and waited. Nobody moved. He dropped to 200. Lydia raised her hand. The yard went quiet in the particular way that yards go quiet when something unexpected happens. Not silent exactly, but focused. People stopped their side conversations. People turned. 200, the auctioneer said, and there was a question in his voice. No other hand went up. 200 going once. Hold on now. That was when Dale Pruitt took the microphone. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. The auctioneer handed it over the way you hand things to men who have the gravity of long tenure. And Dale turned to face the yard, and he said what he said about 20 years from now, and the Mercer girl throwing away her inheritance, and the laughter came. Lydia stood very still. One of the mules, the one with the scarred shoulder, turned its head and looked at her. Animals do this sometimes, and people who have spent time with them will tell you there is nothing behind it, no recognition, no communication. It is movement and coincidence. Lydia knew this. She still held the animal's gaze for 3 seconds before looking back at the auctioneer. "Is the bid closed?" she asked. He cleared his throat. 200 going once, twice. He looked at Dale. Dale shrugged with theatrical generosity, The gesture of a man who had already won the room. Sold. She paid in cash. 4 $50 bills she had kept separate from everything else in an envelope in her coat pocket. The change, all of it, stayed in her checking account, where it sat on top of nothing. The drive from Delwood to the Mercer property took 40 minutes on a good day and longer in November, when the road above the second ridge collected fog that didn't burn off until nearly noon. She had borrowed a trailer from her cousin without explaining why, and the 15 mules rode in the back with the shuffling, resigned patience of animals that had been loaded and unloaded enough times to understand that objection was useless. She didn't know what she was doing. She knew this clearly. She had read about mule logging. She had read Harlan's journals. She had studied the topography of the property using satellite maps and old survey documents she'd found folded inside the back cover of the third composition notebook. She had a theory, carefully built, cross-referenced, grounded in as much research as 3 weeks could produce. But a theory and a skill are not the same thing, and she had no illusions about which one she currently possessed. What she had, underneath the research and the careful planning and the 4 $50 bills, was a feeling she could not fully justify. The feeling that the mountain had been waiting. The feeling that Harlan's journals were not just records but instructions. The feeling that the phrase, "the old trail still holds," was not nostalgia but information. She unloaded the mules into the south pasture as the sun broke through the fog at 11:15. They moved out of the trailer and into the field with the cautious, suspicious attention of animals recalibrating to new ground. She stood at the fence and watched them. She had bought 15 animals she didn't know how to train, on land she didn't know how to work, with no money, no equipment, and no allies. The neighbor's truck slowed on the road above the property. She could see it without turning, the reflection in the old stock tank by the fence line. It slowed, idled for a moment, then moved on. She went inside and made coffee on the propane stove, which required 3 attempts, because the igniter was temperamental and she hadn't yet learned its particular rhythm. She sat at the kitchen table with Harlan's journal from 1998 open in front of her and a legal pad next to it, and she began to make a list of everything she needed to learn. It was a long list. She started at the top. The first week on the property had a quality she could only describe later, to people who asked, as vertical, meaning that everything felt like climbing. The farmhouse itself was sound, which was more than she had expected. Harlan had kept the roof in good repair and the foundation was dry, but the barn needed work she couldn't afford to pay for, which meant she was doing it herself with materials she sourced from what remained on the property and what she could buy with money she didn't have yet. She patched fence lines with wire she found coiled in the equipment shed. She repaired 3 stalls with lumber. She pulled from a collapsed lean-to behind the barn, each board pried loose and re-nailed with the careful economy of someone for whom waste was not an option. The mules watched her work from the pasture with the detached interest that mules seem to bring to human activity, curious but unconvinced. She named them on the 3rd day. This was not sentiment, it was function. Harlan's journals had noted in an entry from 1991 that she had read 3 times, that animals respond better to individual attention when they have individual identifiers, and that the quality of work you can ask from a mule is directly proportional to the quality of relationship you have built with that mule. She needed to know which animal was which, quickly, so she could begin to understand their individual temperaments. She named them after places she had been, cities and towns and one river, because she couldn't think of anything better, and the list was already in her head. Knoxville, Roanoke, Bristol. The scarred one she named Trace, which was not a place but was close enough and felt right. Trace watched her the most steadily of all of them. She noticed this without making too much of it. On the 5th day, a truck came up the driveway. She was in the barn when she heard it, and she came out with a pry bar still in her hand because she hadn't known what else to do with it. The truck was old, older than her, and it parked at an angle that suggested the driver did not expect to stay long. The man who got out moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned through long experience that hurrying causes injuries. He was perhaps 70, perhaps older. He had the kind of face that outdoor work produces over decades, not weathered in the romantic sense, but genuinely worn, the way tools get worn, with a quality of having been used honestly. He looked at the barn. He looked at the mules in the pasture. He looked at her. "You're Harlan's girl," he said. "Granddaughter." "Same to me." He squinted at the mules. "Those are the Kimball animals." I don't know who had them before. Carl Kimball. He ran timber up on Cutter Mountain for 30 years with those animals before his knees went, and his sons didn't want the operation. He was quiet for a moment. They know how to work. They've just been standing still so long they've forgotten they know. She looked at him. How do you know that? Because I trained half of them. He extended a hand. Silas Boon. I lived down on the Boone Creek Road. I knew your grandfather for 40 years. She shook his hand. It was like shaking something made of wood. He told me about you, Silas said. Said you had good instincts, but too much education getting in the way of them. She almost laughed. That sounds like him. He also said you'd come up here eventually, and you'd need help when you did. Silas looked at the barn again, assessing something she couldn't read. I'm not offering charity. I don't have time for that. But if you're serious about what I think you're trying to do, I can show you what I know. What do you think I'm trying to do? He looked at her then, directly, with the focused attention of someone deciding whether to say the true thing or the easy thing. He appeared to decide on the true thing. I think you're trying to bring back what your grandfather spent 40 years building and watching everyone forget, he said. I think you found something in those journals he left, and I think you're stubborn enough to try it. He paused. I also think you have no idea what you're in for. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. I don't. He nodded, as if this was the right answer. Maybe it was. Come out to the pasture, he said. Let me show you how to read what those animals are telling you, because they've been telling you something for 5 days and you haven't been listening right. She set the pry bar against the fence post and followed him. Trace turned his head as they approached, and this time Silas noticed. That one, Silas said without being asked. That one is your lead animal. He's been waiting for you to figure that out. He looked at her. Some of them wait longer than they should. She wasn't sure if he was still talking about the mule. The sun was already moving toward the ridgeline. The November light had that particular quality of mountain afternoons, thin and angled and somehow both bright and cold at the same time. She stood at the fence beside a man she had met 20 minutes ago and looked at 15 animals that were going to either redeem her or ruin her, and she could not tell, in that moment, which way it was going to fall. Down on the county road, she could hear a truck going past at speed. She didn't look up to see whose it was. Silas came back the next morning before she had finished her first cup of coffee. She heard the truck on the gravel and looked out the kitchen window, and he was already walking toward the pasture, not toward the house, which told her something about how he operated. She pulled on her boots and her coat and came out with the coffee still in her hand because she wasn't going to waste it. And by the time she reached the fence line, he had already moved into the pasture and was standing quietly among the mules, the way some people stand in a room full of strangers, relaxed, unhurried, taking stock without making a show of it. You eat breakfast? She called. Hours ago, he said, without turning around. She climbed the fence and came to stand beside him. The mules had arranged themselves in the loose, informal hierarchy that animals establish when they've been together long enough. Trace at the near edge, 3 others close behind him, the rest spread further back. Silas was watching this arrangement the way a man reads a map. First thing, he said, forget everything you read. She started to say something. I don't mean throw it away, he said, before she could. I mean set it down, put it somewhere you can pick it up later. Right now you're watching these animals through a layer of information, and that layer is getting in your way. He looked at her sideways. Can you do that? I can try. Trying isn't doing. Then yes, she said. I can do that. He almost smiled, not quite. What Silas taught her in those first days was not technique. Technique came later, and it came hard, and she was bad at it for longer than she wanted to admit. What he taught her first was attention, the particular, patient, nearly meditative quality of attention that working with large animals requires. The ability to be present without being urgent. The ability to notice without reacting. She had thought of herself as an observant person. She discovered, standing in the pasture with Silas Boon for 3 hours on a cold November morning, that she had been observing the surface of things her entire life. Watch Trace, Silas said. She watched. What do you see? He's looking at the tree line. What else? She looked more carefully. His left ear is back. Both ears just slightly, and his weight has shifted to his hindquarters. Silas was quiet for a moment. There's something moving in the wood line. Deer, probably.
He's deciding whether it's worth caring about. He paused. He decided it isn't. Watch his ears come forward. They came forward. Every mule you'll ever work with, Silas said, is having a conversation with the world around them every second of every day. Your job is to learn the language, not speak it. You can't. Your job is to listen well enough that you stop being a disruption and start being something they can work with. She wrote none of this down. She had learned in the first 5 days that writing things down in front of Silas made him quiet in a way that was not comfortable. The training itself began on the 8th day, and it began with Trace, because Silas had been right about him, and they both knew it. The process was not dramatic. There was no moment of breakthrough, no cinematic triumph. What there was repetition, patient, grinding, unglamorous repetition that made her back hurt and her hands crack in the cold and her confidence dip and recover and dip again. Trace was not difficult. He was, in fact, the easiest of the 15, which was both encouraging and sobering because even the easiest required more from her than she had expected. The harness work came first.
Fitting, adjustment, the discipline of doing it correctly every single time, because a poorly fitted harness doesn't just cause discomfort, it causes injury, and an injured animal cannot work, and an animal that cannot work is a cost she could not carry. Silas watched her fit the harness on Trace for the first time and said nothing until she had finished. "The left shoulder strap," he said. She looked. "2 fingers," he said. "You should be able to get 2 fingers under it. Not 1, not 3. She adjusted it. He watched. "Now the other side." She adjusted that too. "Every time," he said. "Not most times. Every time." She understood this was not about the harness. The financial situation announced itself in the 2nd week in the form of a letter from the county assessor's office, forwarded from her grandfather's address to a mailbox she had not yet checked. Property taxes were due in January. The number on the letter was not catastrophic, but it was real, and real money had a way of clarifying things that theory could not. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter and her legal pad and did the math 3 times, as if repetition might change the outcome. It didn't. She had enough to cover the taxes if she sold the old equipment in the barn. The tractor that hadn't run in 4 years, the brush hog, the hay rake. She had already cataloged them. She put an ad on the county's online classifieds at 9 in the evening and had a response by midnight from a man in Hazel who offered her $800 for the tractor as is. She accepted without negotiating because negotiating required confidence she didn't have the energy for that night. She didn't tell Silas. He didn't ask about money. This was one of the things she was coming to understand about him. He asked only about what he was there to help with, and he left the rest to her, which was either respect or indifference, and she chose to believe it was the former. The other 14 mules progressed at their own pace, which was to say unevenly and sometimes infuriatingly. Roanoke was smart enough to be difficult. She had learned quickly that mule intelligence is not a simple asset, but a double-edged thing, because a smart mule is also a mule that evaluates every request and decides whether it finds the request reasonable. Roanoke frequently found her requests unreasonable. There were mornings when she spent 40 minutes in a standoff with an 800-pound animal that had decided the exercise she was asking for was not worth its time, and she had to find a way through that impasse without force and without capitulation, because Silas had told her on the first day that you never win an argument with a mule and you never let a mule win one either. "Then how do you resolve it?" she had asked. "You make them think it was their idea," he said. She had thought he was joking. He was not joking. Bristol was the one that scared her. He was the largest of the 15, a deep-chested gray with a scar on his near fetlock from something she was never able to determine, and he had a temper that wasn't vicious but was quick, a sudden shift from cooperation to refusal that came without warning signs she could read in those early weeks. Silas watched her work with Bristol on the 3rd week and said nothing for a long time. "You're anticipating him wrong," Silas finally said. "What do you mean?" "You're watching for the trigger. You're trying to catch the moment before he goes." He came into the working area and stood where she had been standing. "The problem is you're so focused on preventing the blow-up that your whole body is tensed up waiting for it. And he can feel that. You being tense is part of what's making him go." She stood back and watched Silas work with Bristol for 10 minutes. The old man moved with an economy she couldn't quite analyze. Small adjustments, slight shifts in body position, the occasional low sound that wasn't quite a word. Bristol did not blow up. Bristol, in fact, seemed almost calm. How long did it take you to learn that? She asked. Silas thought about it. 20 years, he said, give or take. She looked at Bristol. She looked at the 14 other animals in the pasture and the barn. She thought about January and the tax bill and the 11 months remaining on the condition in Harlan's will. I don't have 20 years, she said. No, Silas agreed. So you're going to have to pay closer attention than I did. The town's opinion of her situation had settled by mid-November into a specific variety of pity that she found harder to tolerate than the open mockery at the auction. Pity had a way of making itself comfortable in a room. It sat down, it stayed, it looked at you with that particular expression that says, I see your situation clearly, and I see that it is hopeless, and I have already accommodated myself to your failure. She encountered it at the feed store, where the owner, a heavy-set man named Garrett, who had sold feed to Harlan for 30 years, spoke to her with the careful gentleness of a man addressing someone who has recently received bad news. You need anything special for those animals? Garrett said, the first time she came in. I can order it. Might take a week or two. The standard mix is fine for now, she said. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're agreeing with something they don't believe. She encountered it at the diner when she stopped in for coffee one afternoon, and two women at the next table lowered their voices, but not enough. She caught the word inheritance, and the word mules, and the phrase, such a shame, and she looked at the window and finished her coffee and left a tip that was slightly larger than she could afford because she didn't want anyone's pity extending to her ability to tip properly. She encountered it, most pointedly, at the end of November, when Dale Pruitt stopped his truck on the road above the property while she was working the fence line and rolled down his window. How are those mules working out? He called. She looked up. Fine. That right. He didn't phrase it as a question. He looked at the pasture where 4 of the animals were visible. Winter's going to be hard up here this year. They're saying heavy snow by January. I know. If you find yourself needing to unload them, he said, I can maybe help you move them, as a favor to Harlan. She set down the wire stretcher she was holding. I appreciate that, she said, but I won't need to unload them. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite classify, something between amusement and genuine curiosity, as if he was still deciding which category she belonged in. All right, he said, offer stands. He rolled up his window and drove on. She picked up the wire stretcher and went back to the fence. The first real snow came on December 2nd, earlier than forecast, and it came hard, 6 inches overnight that turned the road into a guessing game and the pasture into a different country. She was up at 4:30 because the barn thermometer had a way of waking her even when she was asleep, some animal instinct she had developed without noticing, and she checked the animals and broke the ice on the water tank and forked fresh hay into the stalls where she had moved the 3 youngest mules for the night. Silas arrived at 7, which was later than usual. Road's bad, he said. I know. I called the county about the salt truck. He looked at her. You called the county? 3rd time this week. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, more like a recalibration. Your grandfather used to do that, he said. Call the county. Did it work? Not usually. He walked toward the barn. But it didn't stop him either. December was when the work became real in a way that the previous weeks, for all their difficulty, had not quite been. November had been learning. December was the beginning of application, moving from the controlled exercises in the pasture to the actual work of navigating timber terrain with animals that were strong enough to do the job but not yet experienced enough, under her direction, to do it consistently. Silas had identified a section of the east slope where 3 mature white oaks had come down in a September storm. Not the valuable timber she eventually intended to harvest, but enough to be useful for practice, to give her and the animals something real to pull against. The first attempt was a failure that would have been funny if she'd had any margin for failure. Trace was harnessed correctly. The rigging was, she thought, correct. The log was a manageable size. She had walked the pull line twice. She had everything, on paper, right. She gave the signal she and Trace had practiced for 2 weeks. Trace moved. The rigging tightened. The log shifted, moved perhaps 2 feet, and then the lead chain caught on a buried root she hadn't seen, and the jolt traveled back up the line with a speed that surprised her, and Trace responded to the unexpected resistance by stopping so abruptly that Lydia, who had been walking beside him, stumbled and went down on one knee in the snow. She stayed there for a moment, knee in the wet snow, and breathed. Trace turned his head and looked at her. Silas, standing 12 feet back, said nothing. She stood up. She assessed the rigging. She found the route. She dug it out with the mattock she had started carrying for exactly this kind of problem, because Harlan's journals had mentioned buried roots 17 times, and she had put it down as theoretical and discovered it was practical. She reset the chain. She gave the signal again. Trace moved. The log came free. It moved 8 feet before she called the stop. It was 8 feet. It was not a victory. It was data. Again, Silas said. She reset. They pulled again and again. By the end of the afternoon, they had moved the log 40 yards down the slope to a flat staging area she had cleared the week before, and the sky was going gray and her knee was bruised, and Trace was breathing hard and she was breathing harder. Silas walked the length of the pole and looked at the log where it had come to rest. "What did you do wrong?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "The first setup. I didn't walk far enough off the line when I was looking for obstructions." "What else?" "My signal timing on the third pull. I was a half-second late." "What else?" She thought harder. "I praised him too much after the second pull. He started anticipating the stop." Silas was quiet for a moment. "That last one most people don't see until the third year," he said. It was the closest he had come to a compliment, and she registered it without making a show of it, because she had learned that making a show of his compliments was a good way to stop receiving them. January brought the taxes and a cold that settled into the hollow where the farmhouse sat like something with intention. The tractor money covered the tax bill with a remainder that she budgeted to the last dollar. She had taken on a small side job, bookkeeping for a hardware store in Delwood, 3 hours on Tuesday mornings, $40 a session, which she had told no one about because she didn't want it to become another data point in the county's ongoing assessment of her failure. She drove into town early, parked behind the hardware store, did the work, drove back. It was unglamorous. It was necessary. She was not above necessary. Silas knew about the bookkeeping. She hadn't told him. He had the particular county-born intelligence that processes local information without appearing to seek it, and one Tuesday he showed up at the farm at noon instead of 8:30 and said only, "Had an errand." And she understood he had adjusted his schedule around hers without being asked and without acknowledging it, and she decided that Silas Boon was, under the layers of quiet and the worn-down exterior, one of the more decent people she had ever met. By mid-January, she had 6 of the 15 mules working to a standard she was beginning to trust. Not a high standard, she was honest enough to know that, but a working standard. A standard where she could take Trace or Roanoke or Bristol or any of 3 others onto actual terrain and expect them to respond correctly more often than not, and where the failures were informative rather than dangerous. The East Slope timber became the training ground, and what she learned on those slopes in January rearranged something fundamental in the way she thought about the property. The terrain was steep, steeper than she had understood from the maps, the kind of steep where every step requires its own decision. A skidder or a dozer would chew it to pieces. She had known this theoretically. She understood it now in her body, in the way her own footing shifted and her weight redistributed constantly as she moved alongside the animals. She understood viscerally what Harlan had written in 1987 about the skidder and the operator and the ground that gave way. Machines impose. Mules negotiate. The mountain had its own terms, and the machines had spent 40 years refusing to honor them, and the mountain had spent 40 years making them pay for it. She found the first reference to the buried well on a Tuesday evening in late January in the journal from 1994. She had been reading the journals in order, taking her time, letting herself absorb them slowly. She had reached the mid-90s journals, which were denser than the earlier ones. Harlan had written more in those years, longer entries, more discursive, as if he was working something out. The entry was dated March of that year, and it was mostly about spring drainage on the north side of the property, but near the end there was a paragraph that stopped her. Walked the upper trail today to the 3rd marker stone. The spring is running clear. Found the old well cap has shifted again, 3rd time this winter. The pressure beneath it is more than I expected for a dry season. I have written to the county water office, but they show no interest. What is down there is significant. I am more certain of this than I have been of most things. She read it twice. She turned to the next entry, which was about fence line repair, and said nothing about the well. She turned to the entry after that. Nothing. She marked the page and set the journal down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The kitchen ceiling, not the bedroom ceiling, so there was no Tennessee-shaped water stain to look at, just bare paint with a hairline crack running from the light fixture toward the east wall. She thought about the old trail still holds. She thought about the journal from 1987. She thought about the survey documents she had found in the back of the third composition notebook, which showed the property boundaries in a way that included, in one corner, an annotation she had not been able to read clearly. She went and got the notebook. She held the survey document under the kitchen light. The annotation, in her grandfather's small, careful hand, said, "Upper Spring, see deed enclosure." She looked at the cedar chest in the bedroom. She had removed all 41 journals. She had gone through every item. She had found the journals and some old photographs and a pair of work gloves worn so thin at the fingertips she could nearly see through them. She went back to the chest. She lifted it and looked beneath it. She pressed on the bottom panel. Nothing. She set it down. She looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you know is keeping a secret. Then she went to bed because it was past 10 and Silas came at 7:30 and she needed to be functional. But she lay awake for longer than she should have, staring at the ceiling, thinking about pressure building under a well cap in a dry season, thinking about a man who had walked a trail 3 times in a single year and written down what he found. February arrived with the particular brutality of second-month winters in the Blue Ridge, a cold that had settled in long enough to feel permanent, so that warmth seemed like a rumor from another season. 12 of the 15 mules were now working at a level that satisfied Silas, which was the metric she had come to use because it was more reliable than her own satisfaction. Her own satisfaction was too susceptible to hope. It was during this period that the whispers started. She noticed it first at the feed store, where Garrett asked, with genuine rather than polite interest, how the training was going. She noticed it at the hardware store on her Tuesday bookkeeping morning, when the owner, a quiet man named Phil, who had never done more than nod at her, asked if it was true she was doing mule logging up on the Mercer property. She noticed it when a truck she didn't recognize slowed on the county road above the farm and idled for a long moment before moving on. She mentioned it to Silas on a Wednesday when the temperature had climbed just enough to make outdoor work possible again. "People are asking about what we're doing," she said. He was adjusting a trace chain on Roanoke and didn't look up. "I know. Does that bother you?" He thought about it. "Depends on who's asking." "Does it bother you that Dale Pruitt is asking?" Now he looked up. "Dale's asking?" "Phil at the hardware store told me Dale came in last week asking how my operation was going." She paused. Phil seemed to think it was funny. Silas looked at Roanoke for a moment, then back at her. "Dale Pruitt has 400 acres of timber on his property that he hasn't been able to harvest because the lower slopes are too steep for any equipment he's been able to bring in. He's been sitting on it for 6 years. He went back to the trace chain. He's asking because he's starting to wonder if he made a mistake when he laughed. She was quiet for a moment. "Is he right?" "Too early to say." He finished with the chain and straightened up, his joints audible in the cold. "Ask me in the spring." What she didn't say, and what she turned over in her mind for several days afterward, was that she had found 3 more journal entries about the well. One from 1996, one from 1999, and one from 2003. Each of them mentioned the upper trail. Each of them mentioned the stone markers. And the entry from 2003, the one that sat at the front of her mind and wouldn't be shifted, said something that she hadn't been able to fully interpret but couldn't stop reading. The water office sent a man out finally. He walked the upper trail with me and looked at the well and said, "It was outside their jurisdiction. I told him what I believe is down there. He was polite. He did not believe me. I have been wrong about many things in my life, but I do not believe I am wrong about this. I have written it in the deed enclosure because some things should not depend on a man's memory alone." The deed enclosure. She had been back to the cedar chest twice more. She had measured the interior depth against the exterior height. There was a difference of 3.5 inches that she had initially attributed to the thickness of the wood. She measured again, more carefully. The base of the chest was solid hardwood, old growth, at least 1.5 inches thick, far thicker than a functional base required. She got a flathead screwdriver. She worked the edge of the bottom panel carefully, not wanting to damage it. It took 20 minutes, and she stripped the head of one screw and had to get pliers. And when the panel finally lifted, it did so with a sound that was almost, not quite, but almost like a held breath releasing. Beneath it was a piece of oilcloth, folded and sealed with old wax, and beneath the oilcloth was an envelope. She sat on the floor of the bedroom for a long moment with the envelope in her hands. It was addressed, in Harlan's handwriting, to the one who stays. She opened it carefully, because it was the only copy of whatever was inside, and because some things deserve care even when you are badly wanting to rush. Inside was a document, several pages, folded together, legal language at the top, old notary stamps, and with it, a single sheet in Harlan's hand, not formal, not a journal entry, just a letter, the kind of letter you write when you have decided to trust someone you cannot yet see. She read it through once, quickly, because she couldn't help herself. Then she sat very still for a while. Then she read it again, slowly, the way you read something that is changing the dimensions of the room around you. Outside, one of the mules, she thought it was Trace from the sound, moved in the barn, a slow shifting of weight, the particular sound of a large animal settling into its own patience. The wind was up tonight. The ridge above the property caught it and turned it into something that sounded, if you were tired enough, almost like language. She folded the document carefully, put it back in the envelope, and sat for a long time thinking about a man she had not visited enough and a mountain that had been keeping its account. In the morning she would tell Silas. He would need to know, because what she had read changed the calculus of everything they were building, changed the reason behind the careful work on the slopes and the patient hours in the pasture, and the Tuesday mornings at the hardware store bookkeeping for $40 a session. It changed the shape of the year ahead. But the morning was still hours away. The envelope was in her hands. The barn was settling. She sat with it a while longer. She told Silas the next morning. She waited until they had finished the first session with the animals. An hour of groundwork on the east slope that had gone well enough. Bristol cooperating with a steadiness that still surprised her. And then she asked him to come inside. He looked at her face and came without asking why, which was how she knew he had already understood that something had shifted. She put the envelope on the kitchen table between them. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then he looked at her. "Harlan's?" he said. "Hidden in the base of the cedar chest. There's a false bottom." He was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees on the south slope with a sound like something being dragged slowly across a wood floor. "Did you know about it?" she asked. She kept her voice neutral because she genuinely didn't know what she wanted the answer to be. Silas picked up the envelope. He turned it over. He read the front, the one who stays, and something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read, something that was grief and recognition in the same expression. He set it back down without opening it. "I knew he was keeping something," Silas said. "He told me once, maybe 10 years ago, that he had written down the important things and put them where only the right person would find them." He looked at the envelope. "I figured it was a will. Raymond talked about the will for years." "It's not the will," she said. "It's a deed amendment and a letter." He waited. "The upper trail," she said, "the one he mentions in the journals. It runs to a section of the property that was separated from the main deed in 1962 by a boundary error, a surveying mistake. 12 acres on the upper ridge, including the spring and whatever is under it." She paused. "Harlan discovered the error in 1991. He hired an attorney in Asheville and had it corrected and recorded. But he never filed the correction with the county assessor. He left it in the envelope instead." Silas was looking at her steadily. "Why would he do that?" "He explains it in the letter." She had read the letter 4 times by then. She nearly had it memorized, the way you memorize things that matter before you mean to. "He said he didn't want to file it until someone was working the land properly. He said if the land went to someone who was just going to sell it, the correction didn't matter. But if someone came who understood what the land was for, they'd need that 12 acres, the spring, and what he believed was underneath the spring." "The well," Silas said. She looked at him. "You knew about the well." "I knew he thought something was there. He walked me up to the spring once, must have been 2005 or 2006, showed me the cap, said the pressure under it wasn't consistent with a normal spring-fed well." Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, the way men look at ceilings when they're sorting through a long history. "I thought he was chasing something that wasn't there. He was getting older, and sometimes older men get attached to ideas." "He wasn't wrong," she said. She pulled out the second document, the one she hadn't shown him yet. It was a water survey from 2001, conducted by an independent hydrologist Harlan had paid for himself, whose findings Harlan had apparently never shown anyone. The survey described what was almost certainly an artesian aquifer beneath the upper ridge section, of significant volume, with water quality measurements that put it in the highest tier of natural spring water purity. The hydrologist had written, in the final paragraph, that the formation was uncommon in this region and of considerable potential value, though any development would require proper permitting and geological assessment. Silas read it slowly. He read it again. He set it down on the table next to the deed amendment and looked at both documents together. Harlan paid for this out of his own pocket, he said, and then he locked it in the bottom of a cedar chest and waited. For you. For whoever came and stayed, she said. I don't think he knew it would be me. I think he hoped. Silas was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen clock ticked. One of the mules moved in the barn. The particular sound of trace shifting weight, which she could now distinguish from the others the way you eventually learn to identify voices without seeing faces. What are you going to do? Silas asked. File the deed correction, she said, and then find out what's actually down there. He nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty, and set it back down and didn't ask for more. That's going to cost money you don't have. I know. And it's going to attract attention. I know that too. He looked at her. You understand what kind of attention? Dale Pruitt kind of attention. Among others. He folded his hands on the table. When Harlan filed that boundary correction in Asheville, he would have had to notify the adjacent landowners of the survey amendment. One of those adjacent landowners, on the Upper Ridge side, is a man named Conrad Vess. He owns about 600 acres up there, logging rights, the whole picture. He has been operating under the assumption that the Upper Ridge Spring is on his property or at minimum accessible through his land. She hadn't known this. She sat with it for a moment. Did Harlan know that? Harlan knew everything about this county, Silas said. The question is what Vess knows now and what he'll do when you file. She picked up the deed amendment and looked at the notary stamps, the recorded date, the signature of the attorney in Asheville. It was real. It was legal. It had been real and legal for 32 years, just undisclosed. It's our land, she said. The filing just makes it official on the county record. I know that, Silas said. I'm just telling you that knowing you're right and having people leave you alone about it are two different things. She understood this. She had been understanding it since the auction yard, since Dale Pruitt's voice on the microphone, since the truck slowing on the road above the property. Being right had not, in her experience, been a reliable shield. But she also understood something else, sitting in that kitchen with the envelope and the documents spread on the table between her and Silas Boon, something that she hadn't been able to name clearly until this moment. The work she had done in the previous 3 months, the harness fitting and the rigging and the January cold and the $40 Tuesday mornings and the 16 hours in the cedar chest journals, all of it had been building towards something she couldn't yet see clearly. Harlan had seen it. He had been patient enough to wait for the right person. She was not going to be less patient than a man who had waited 32 years. File the deed, Silas said. He said it like he was closing a door. And let's make sure by the time Vess or anyone else comes looking, your operation is solid enough that they've got no angle. She nodded. She gathered the documents carefully, returned them to the oilcloth and the envelope, and put the envelope in the inside pocket of her barn coat, which was where she kept things she needed to keep close. Then she stood up and went back out to the animals, because there was still 4 hours of daylight, and the south slope logs were not going to move themselves. March came in warm, deceptively, the kind of early warmth that people who know mountain weather don't trust. The mud season arrived behind it 2 weeks later with a thoroughness that was almost personal, roads that looked passable becoming sinkholes, fields that had seemed firm turning overnight into something closer to wet concrete. It was, Silas told her matter-of-factly, the worst mud season he could remember in a decade. It was also the season that separated what she was doing from everything else operating in the county's timber economy. The two active logging operations in Clanton County both ran skidders and log trucks. Both had shut down completely by the second week of March, because the access roads to their operation areas were impassable to anything heavier than a pickup. One of the operators, a man named Deacon Firth, who ran about 40 acres of timber on the west side of the county, lost a skidder to a mudslide on March 14th. The machine went sideways on a slope that had looked fine at 7 in the morning and turned by 10 into something that wouldn't hold weight. Nobody was hurt. The skidder was a different story. Lydia heard about it at the feed store. Garrett told her with the careful neutrality of a man sharing bad news about someone he respects, watching her face to see how she received it. She received it without visible satisfaction because satisfaction would have been indecent, but she filed it away. The mules had not stopped working. This was the thing that she could not have fully predicted, and that Silas had not spelled out for her in advance, either because he'd assumed she understood or because he'd wanted her to discover it herself. The advantage of mule logging in mud season was not incidental, it was structural. The animal's hooves, spread and flexing with each step, distributed weight in a way no wheeled or tracked machine could replicate. Where a skidder compacted and rutted and eventually broke through, the mules moved across soft ground, leaving marks that the ground recovered from within a season. She had read this. She had believed it intellectually. Watching it happen, watching trace. Move along a slope edge that had turned to slick, dark mud overnight and come through it with the steady, deliberate sureness of an animal that had been doing this kind its entire memory was something different from reading about it. She had brought the first real load to the road cut on the Upper East Slope on March 7th. Not the fallen oaks from January. She had worked through those in February, moved them to the staging flat, gotten them measured and sorted. This was standing timber, carefully selected. 2 mature black walnuts that had been cracked and were declining, and 3 white oaks from the edge of a section that Harlan's journals had specifically identified as overstocked, where selective removal would benefit the remaining trees. She had marked the trees herself, with Silas walking behind her questioning every mark, asking her to justify each one. Twice he had told her she was wrong. Once she'd held her ground and been right. The second time she'd reconsidered and changed her mark. The logs came down in 3 hauls over 2 days. Trace and Roanoke working the steepest section, Bristol and 2 of the other larger animals, handling the lower slope where the ground was softer and the pull angles were more forgiving. She had expected it to take 3 days. It took 2. She had expected at least one significant problem. There were 4 small ones, and she worked through all of them without losing a day. The logs sat at the road staging area, and she took photographs and sent them to 3 specialty mills she had identified through research the previous winter. Not commodity mills, but the kind of operations that dealt in high-grade hardwood for furniture makers and instrument builders and architectural millwork. She had written to them in January, carefully, explaining what she was doing and why the timber she intended to produce would be different. 2 had not responded. 1, a mill called Heartwood, operating out of a small town in southwestern Virginia, had sent a brief reply saying they would be interested to see samples when she had them. She called Heartwood on March 9th. The man who answered was named Eugene Greer, and he had the voice of someone who had been dealing in wood long enough that he heard fraud and inflated claims so regularly that his default position was a polite, practiced skepticism that you had to earn your way through. "I got your letter," he said, "and I've gotten letters like yours before, so I want to be straight with you. The market for high-grade selective harvest hardwood is real, but small. Most people who claim to be doing it aren't doing it in any way that produces material that's meaningfully different from standard stock." "I know," she said. A brief pause. "You know." "I know because I've read enough about the industry to understand that the differentiation only matters at the log level if the selection process is genuinely different. I've marked timber on a property that hasn't been logged in 40 years, following a selective protocol based on my grandfather's management records from 4 decades of observations. The black I'm sending you samples from was growing in a stand that hasn't seen machinery since 1979. The growth rings are going to tell you something the certificate of origin alone can't." Another pause, longer this time. "Send me the samples," Greer said, "and include your ring count documentation if you have it." She had it. Silas had taught her to core sample in late January, something she had initially thought was excessive and had come to understand was essential. She sent the samples on March 12th. She waited. She kept working. The deed filing happened the last week of March, handled through the attorney in Asheville. The daughter of the man Harlan had originally used, operating from the same office, who had found the original records in her father's archived files, and who seemed, when Lydia called her, to have been expecting this call for some years. Her name was Patricia Oakes, and she was methodical and clear and charged a fair rate. And she told Lydia that the filing would take approximately 2 weeks to process through the county and that adjacent landowners would be notified as a matter of procedure. Conrad Vess, Lydia said. He's the one I'm concerned about. I know who Conrad Vess is, Patricia said. My father dealt with him twice. He's not pleasant, but he's not stupid. He'll have a lawyer look at the documentation before he does anything, and the documentation is solid. Your grandfather was thorough. He was, Lydia said. The notification goes out when the filing is recorded. After that, it's a matter of waiting to see how he responds. She paused. If he responds badly, we'll deal with it. The record is clean. Lydia thanked her and hung up and sat in the truck in the parking lot of the county clerk's office for a few minutes, watching people come and go through the glass door. An older woman with a rolling cart. A young man in work clothes who held the door for her without being asked. Ordinary Tuesday behavior in a small county seat, completely indifferent to the fact that a 32-year-old document was about to be officially recognized and a 12-acre question was about to get its answer. She drove back to the farm. Eugene Greer called on April 4th. She was in the barn when her phone rang, adjusting the hitch on a new set of traces she had ordered in February and just received, and she answered without looking at the number because she was expecting Silas. Miss Mercer. Greer's voice was different from the first call. The skepticism was still there. It was structural in him, she was beginning to understand, more feature than bug. But beneath it was something else, something that sounded like a man recalibrating. Mr. Greer, I had my mill manager look at your samples, and then I looked at them myself. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression of a man choosing words carefully. The walnut rings are exceptional. 62 years of growth on a slope that apparently has never seen compaction, which is what you said and which the wood confirms. The grain consistency is, it's not common. I've been buying timber for 27 years, and the grain consistency in your sample is not common. She was very still. What are you currently sitting on? He asked. In terms of inventory. 2 black walnuts and 3 white oaks, staged and ready. Plus I have marked selections in 3 additional sections that I can harvest over the next 4 to 6 weeks. What volume are we talking for the marked selections? She had the numbers in her notebook. She gave them to him. He was quiet long enough that she checked the call was still connected. I want to come see the operation, he said. Before we talk price, I want to see how you're working the slope and what you're leaving behind. When? 2 weeks. I can be there April 18th. All right, she said. And Miss Mercer. He paused again, in that particular way that meant the next sentence was the important one. If what I see matches what these samples are telling me, I'm going to want to talk about a long-term arrangement, not spot purchases, an arrangement. She said she understood. She thanked him and ended the call. She stood in the barn with the phone in her hand and the unfinished hitch on the workbench and the smell of hay and animals around her, and she allowed herself, for approximately 30 seconds, to feel the specific relief of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a long time and has just been told they might be able to set it down. Then she picked up the hitch and went back to work. She did not tell Silas about the call immediately. She held it for a day, the way you hold things you don't fully trust yet, turning it over, looking for the places where it might give way. Then she told him on the second morning, over coffee, the way she had told him about the deed documents. He listened without interrupting. He finished his coffee. He set the cup down. 27 years, he said. That's what he said. A man who's been buying timber for 27 years doesn't say grain consistency is not common unless he means it. Silas turned his cup in his hands, something she had noticed he did when he was thinking. What did you tell him about the operation? What we're doing, the selective marking, the mule haul, the no machinery protocol on the sensitive slopes. Did he ask about it or did you offer it? He asked. Silas nodded. He asked because he knows the wood doesn't come out that way unless the operation is right. He's dealt with people who claim to be doing selective work and found out they weren't. He looked at her. You need to be ready for him to look hard. I want him to look hard. Silas studied her for a moment. Yeah, he said. I think you do. Conrad Vess's response to the deed notification arrived not as a call or a letter, but as a truck parked at the top of the Mercer driveway on a Saturday morning in mid-April. A newer truck, expensive, driven by a man she didn't recognize who knocked on the farmhouse door
and introduced himself as working for Vess's attorney and asked if Lydia Mercer was available. She was available. She came to the door in her work clothes and boots because she had been in the barn, and she was not going to change to receive a messenger. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a letter on legal letterhead stating that Conrad Vess disputed the boundary correction filing and intended to challenge the recorded deed amendment, citing a 1962 county survey that he claimed established the eastern ridge boundary in his favor. She read it standing at the door. The man who had delivered it waited. "Is there anything you need from me?" she asked. "Mr. Vess's attorney would like to know if you'd be willing to meet." "Tell him to contact Patricia Oakes in Asheville," she said. "She handles our legal matters." She used our deliberately. She wasn't sure why. The man noted something in a small notebook and walked back to his truck. She called Patricia from the kitchen table, still in her barn coat. Patricia received the information with the equanimity of a woman who had expected exactly this and said she would respond to Vess's attorney within the week, and that Lydia should not communicate directly with Vess or his representatives. "How serious is the challenge?" Lydia asked. "The 1962 survey he's citing is the document that contained the original boundary error," Patricia said. "The same error my father's firm corrected in 1991. His attorney either doesn't know that yet or is hoping you don't." A brief pause. "This is a pressure move. He's hoping you'll negotiate rather than litigate." "I'm not negotiating the boundary." "I didn't think you would be," Patricia said. "I'll draft the response." Eugene Greer arrived on April 18th in a truck that had seen significant use and wore it honestly, which she took as a good sign about the man. He was older than she had expected from his voice, mid-60s, compact, with the kind of permanent squint that outdoor work produces over decades. He shook her hand without preamble and looked at the pasture where 5 of the mules were visible and said nothing for a moment. "Those are good animals," he said. "They've had time to figure themselves out." He looked at her. "How many people told you this was a bad idea?" "Most of them." He turned back to the pasture. "Show me the slope." She walked him up the east side along the cut she had opened in late February and extended through March. She showed him the haul lines, the staging flat, the marked trees in the adjacent section. She showed him the root structure on the soil where the mules had worked versus a section 30 yards over where a neighbor's fence crew had brought in a small dozer 2 years before. The difference in compaction was visible, measurable, and Greer crouched down and pressed the soil with 2 fingers and looked at it the way you look at something that confirms what you already suspected. She showed him the marked selections, the overstocked sections, the declining trees, the careful isolation of the old growth that she was not taking and did not intend to take. "Who marked these?" he asked. "I did. Silas Boon walked with me." "Silas Boon is still working? You know him?" "By reputation. He trained mules for the Kimball operation for about 15 years. Greer stood and looked up the slope toward the ridge. "If Silas Boon walked these marks with you, that tells me something." He looked at the operation for 2 hours. He asked questions that were specific and practical and occasionally difficult, and she answered what she knew and said plainly when she didn't know, which happened twice, and she watched him receive her uncertainty without marking it against her. I was a man who had been lied to enough times that honesty, when it appeared, was identifiable. They went back down to the farmhouse. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had read Harlan's journals, where she had opened the envelope, where she had told Silas about Eugene Greer, and Greer put both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment. "I want to buy what you have staged," he said, "and I want a first-right agreement on your next 4 harvests at pricing tied to ring count and grain grade, which we'll set together." He named a price for the staged timber that was nearly double what she had calculated as optimistic. She kept her face still. "The ring count and grain grade protocol," she said. "I'd want that in writing, with the grading criteria defined before we sign, not after." He looked at her. "You've thought about this." "I've had time." "Who taught you to negotiate?" "Nobody," she said. "I just know what I don't want to agree to by accident." He almost smiled. The almost was enough. "All right," he said. "Patricia Oakes, you said?" "Patricia Oakes." He wrote the name down and drank his coffee. She watched him look out the kitchen window at the pasture, where Trace had come to the fence line and was standing with his head up, watching the house with the steady, unhurried attention that she had come to recognize as his natural state, alert to everything, reactive to nothing.
That's your lead animal, Greer said. Ed? Yes. He knows he is. He always did, she said. It just took me a while to catch up. Greer left at 2 in the afternoon. She stood in the driveway and watched his truck move down the road and out of sight. Then she went into the barn and stood for a moment in the dim, hay-smelling quiet and let the full weight of the previous 5 months sit in her chest the way heavy things sit, not comfortably, not painlessly, but solidly, proof of weight, evidence of real. She had an agreement in principle with a premium mill. She had a deed filing that established 12 acres Vess was going to fight her for. She had 15 mules who had forgotten they were worthless. She had 1 season of timber work behind her and the spring ahead of her in the upper trail, which she still had not walked, still waiting at the top of the property, like a sentence that hadn't finished yet. Silas came at 4. She told him about Greer. He listened. He asked 3 questions about the pricing structure and seemed satisfied with the answers. What about Vess? He said. Patricia is handling it. That's not what I asked. She understood what he was asking. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she had found to think about things that scared her. I think he's going to push hard, she said. I think when he realizes the 1962 argument won't hold, he's going to find something else to push on. He might, Silas said. He's not above it. But I'm not moving off the boundary. Silas looked at her for a long moment. The barn light was going amber in the late afternoon, the particular warm light that old barns catch at the end of the day and hold like something borrowed. Trace turned his head toward them from his stall. No, Silas said. I didn't think you would be. He said it the way he said the things that mattered, plain, without adornment, without performing the emotion underneath it. She had learned to hear what was in the plainness. Outside, the last light was leaving the upper ridge, going fast the way spring light goes. And somewhere above the tree line, the old trail ran through the stone markers to a well cap that had been holding pressure for 32 years. And she thought about Harlan walking it 3 times in a single year, counting what he found, writing it down in a composition notebook, waiting. She thought about patience, about what it cost and what it was worth, and how those 2 numbers were rarely the same. She fed the mules. She locked the barn. She went inside. Patricia Oakes called on a Thursday morning in late April, and Lydia knew from the first syllable that it was not routine. Vess's attorney filed a motion to delay the deed recording, Patricia said. They're arguing procedural defect in the 1991 correction, claiming the notarization was improperly witnessed. Lydia was standing at the barn door with her coffee. The morning was cool and clear, and the kind of April morning that made you believe in the possibility of things, which made the call feel worse by contrast. Is the notarization improperly witnessed? No, I've pulled the original filing. The notarization is clean. But the motion buys them 60 days while the county reviews it, and 60 days is 60 days. Patricia paused. There's something else. Vess has made an offer. What kind of offer? He wants to purchase the upper 12 acres outright. He's offering market rate plus 20%. Lydia set her coffee on the fence post. Tell me the number. Patricia told her the number. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number that 4 months ago, standing at a livestock auction with 4 $50 bills in her pocket, would have seemed like a different country entirely. It was the kind of number that solved problems. The bookkeeping Tuesdays, the tax bills, the equipment she didn't have, the second winter she was going to need to prepare for. It was a real number in a way that made her aware, suddenly and uncomfortably, of how provisional everything she'd built still was. He knows about the aquifer survey, she said. He must, Patricia said. The premium he's offering doesn't make sense otherwise. She picked her coffee back up. It had gone cold. What's the deadline on the offer? 2 weeks? And if I don't accept? He proceeds with the procedural challenge and likely files a separate adverse possession claim based on his historical access to the spring. Patricia's voice was careful and professional, which was another way of saying the news was worse than she was making it sound. The adverse possession argument is weaker than the boundary challenge. He'd have to demonstrate continuous, open, hostile use for over 20 years, and your grandfather's journals likely contradict that. But it would take time to defeat, and time costs money. Lydia understood the architecture of it. She understood it the way you understand something that has been designed specifically for you, something someone has built with your particular constraints in mind. Vess had looked at her situation, young, undercapitalized, operating on a year-long deadline in a will condition, and he had built a pressure system calibrated to those exact dimensions. 2 weeks, a number large enough to be tempting, legal friction expensive enough to make refusal painful. It was well constructed. She could see that clearly, and seeing it clearly didn't make it easier. She told Silas that afternoon. He listened without any visible reaction, which was how he listened to things that made him angry. She had learned this about him, that his stillness was not indifference but a kind of discipline, the same discipline he brought to working with difficult animals, the refusal to let emotion drive the response. "What are you thinking?" he asked when she'd finished. "I'm thinking he wants it badly enough to pay 20% over market and run a 60-day delay play at the same time, which means he's not patient. He's trying to make me feel the clock." "You feel it?" She thought about being honest. "Yes." Silas nodded. "That's not a weakness. That's just having a real situation." He was quiet for a moment. "What does Greer's agreement look like if you lose the upper 12? She had already done this math, twice. The way you check math, you don't want to believe. "The stage timber we have is fine. The first right agreement covers 3 sections on the east and south slopes. But the upper ridge section, the one I haven't harvested yet, is inside the disputed 12 acres. That's the oldest growth on the property. That's where the grain Greer's excited about comes from. So losing the 12 means losing your best timber relationship. Long term? Yes." Silas looked at the ridge line. The upper trail was up there, somewhere above the tree line, marked by stones she still hadn't seen for herself. "What did Harlan say about it?" "In the letter." She had been expecting this question. She went inside and got the envelope and brought it out to the fence where Silas was standing, and she read him the relevant section of Harlan's letter. Not all of it, because some of it was private in a way she hadn't yet resolved, but the part about the 12 acres. "I spent 30 years watching men take from this mountain what they could reach easily and leave behind what required patience. The upper ridge is what it is because nobody had reason enough to be careful with it. That is a strange kind of protection, being saved by your own inaccessibility. I want whoever comes here to understand that the value of the upper section is not only in what it holds underground, it is in what it has been allowed to become above it. Do not trade that for a short answer to a money problem." She folded the letter and put it back. She didn't look at Silas. "Short answer to a money problem," Silas said. "Yes." He was quiet. A crow called once from somewhere on the south slope and then went quiet too. "What are you going to do?" he asked. It was the same question he had asked in February, sitting at the kitchen table with the deed documents. And she understood he asked it not because he didn't know, but because he believed the answer needed to come from her out loud. "I'm going to turn down the offer," she said, "and I'm going to call Patricia and tell her to fight the procedural challenge, and I'm going to figure out how to pay for the legal work." "How?" She had been working on this since the call that morning. It was not a beautiful solution. It was the kind of solution that required swallowing something uncomfortable, which she had found, over the previous 5 months, was usually the only kind available. "The first payment from Greer for the stage timber covers 2 months of legal fees. After that, I need another revenue source." She paused. "There's been interest from 2 landowners about using the mules for timber access on their property. I've been putting it off because I didn't want to spread the operation thin. But if I take one of them on, carefully, on terms I control, it covers the gap." Silas turned to look at her. "Which 2? "Phil Darden on the North County Road, and Dale Pruitt." A silence. "Dale Pruitt asked you?" "Last week. His foreman called." She met his eyes. "He's got the 400 acres of timber on the lower slopes that haven't been accessible. He wants to know if I'd bring the mules." Silas turned this over for a moment. She could see him working through it, the satisfaction that came with it, which was real and human and which both of them were capable of feeling, and the practical question beneath the satisfaction. "What are your terms?" he said. My protocol, my marking, my haul lines, my timetable. He doesn't direct the operation. He provides access and pays the day rate I set. He'll push back on that." "I know. He's used to being the one who sets terms." "I know that too." She looked at the pasture where Trace was standing at the near fence in his customary position, attentive, settled, watching. "But he needs what I have more than I need his particular 400 acres. There are other landowners." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Harlan would have handled it the same way. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or just an observation. With Silas, sometimes those were the same thing. She walked the upper trail for the first time in the first week of May. She had been putting it off in a way she couldn't entirely explain to herself. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. The reluctance to close a question that had been open for months, as if the trail could only disappoint the idea she had built of it. Silas had mentioned it twice without pushing, which was his way of pushing. On a Tuesday morning, when the weather was clear and the slopes were dry, and there was no operational reason not to, she got her boots and her notebook and went. The trail was real. That was the first thing she registered, and it sounds obvious, but it wasn't. She had spent enough time looking at old maps and journal references that some part of her had worried it might be overgrown to nothing, reduced to a suggestion. It was not. The path was narrow, and in places the brush had grown across it and needed to be pushed through, but the ground beneath was solid, and the stone markers were exactly where Harlan's journals described them. 3 flat stones set upright at intervals, each one weathered and patient. Not placed to be dramatic, but placed to be found. The spring was beyond the 3rd marker. She heard it before she saw it. Not the sound of running water exactly, but a particular quality of the air, a coolness that didn't match the May morning, and then the sound underneath it, barely audible, the movement of water beneath the surface. The well cap was a heavy iron disc, old, set into a rough stone collar that someone, Harlan, she assumed, or maybe someone before Harlan, had built with unhurried care. The cap had shifted exactly as the journals described. She could see the gap at one edge, and from the gap came a smell that was clean and mineral and cold, the smell of deep water. She sat on the ground next to it for a while. She was not a person given to ceremony. She didn't do anything significant in those few minutes. Didn't speak, didn't perform any particular feeling. She just sat with the fact of it. The 12 acres, the spring, the aquifer beneath it that a hydrologist had assessed in 2001 and a man named Lydia Mercer had written about in a composition notebook in 1994. All of it real, all of it here, all of it the result of a man deciding to wait for the right person. She wrote in her notebook for a while, not poetic observations but practical ones. The condition of the cap, the smell and character of what she could sense from the gap, the measurement of the stone collar, the angle of the slope above the spring and how it drained. She was going to need a geologist. She was going to need to understand exactly what the aquifer assessment from 2001 still accurately described, or what had changed in 23 years. She was going to need to think carefully about what development, if any, was appropriate, because Harlan's letter had said something specific about that too. What is there should serve the land first, not be served by it. And she intended to take that seriously. She walked back down the trail slowly, the way you walk when your mind is working faster than your feet. She called Patricia from the kitchen that evening and told her to reject Vess's offer formally and in writing, and to proceed with the defense of the deed recording on all fronts. Understood, Patricia said. I'll send the rejection tomorrow. Patricia, Lydia paused. I walked the spring today. A brief silence on the line. And? It's real. Another silence, this one with a different texture. My father believed your grandfather, Patricia said. He told me once that Lydia Mercer was the most careful man he had ever worked with, and that careful men are usually right about the things they're careful about. Lydia didn't say anything to that. It was the kind of sentence that didn't need a response. She was thinking about the old woman when she ended the call. The old woman's name was Cora Vance, and Lydia had met her in February at the feed store. A coincidence of timing, Lydia arriving for a supply pickup at the same moment Cora was there for something she never specified. Cora was 81, possibly older. She was vague about it in a way that suggested she considered the number irrelevant. And she had lived on the county road 2 miles below the Mercer property for most of her life. She had known Harlan. It emerged in the conversation over 20 minutes in the parking lot while Garrett loaded Lydia's truck. Known Harlan's wife before she died, had known the property in its working years, had a memory of the mountain that went back to a time Lydia could only access through composition notebooks. She was also the person who had first confirmed for Lydia that the whispers were changing direction. People are talking different about you than they were, Cora had said, in the direct way she said most things. In November, they were talking about you like you were a cautionary tale. Now they're talking about you like you might know something. What changed? Lydia had asked. The mud season, Cora said. When Deacon Firth lost that skidder and you kept working, people noticed. It was Cora who had told her in that same parking lot conversation to watch out for Conrad Vess. Not because of anything specific, she hadn't known about the deed situation then, or if she hadn't let on, but with the particular certainty of a woman who had watched a man operate in a county for 40 years and had made an accurate assessment. He's the kind of man who mistakes other people's patience for weakness, Cora had said. Your grandfather understood that. They had words about it once, years back. Harlan won, but Vess didn't forget. Lydia had written that down in her notebook later and thought about it often in the weeks that followed. She visited Cora in early May, 3 days after walking the upper trail, bringing coffee from the diner because she had learned that Cora drank 3 cups a morning and appreciated it when someone understood this. She sat in Cora's kitchen, which was warm and slightly cluttered in the way of houses where a person has lived alone long enough that objects accumulate personal history. And she told Cora about the deed, about Vess, about the spring and the aquifer survey. Cora listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Lydia finished, Cora was quiet for a moment. She looked at her coffee cup. She looked out the window at the county road. Harlan told me about the water, Cora said. Not the survey. Just that he believed something significant was there. He said it felt like a responsibility. She paused. He said that about a lot of things on that property. He felt the weight of it. So do I, Lydia said. Cora looked at her then, the direct, unsentimental look that was her primary mode of attention. I know you do, that's why you're still there. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Vess is going to make the next 2 months ugly. You know that. I'm expecting it. Expecting it and being ready for it are different things. Cora set her cup down. When he can't get the land legal, he'll try other ways. He's done it before. He'll make things difficult with the county permitting for your operation. He might try to pressure your buyers. He'll use what he has. Lydia thought about Eugene Greer and the first right agreement that was not yet finalized in writing. She thought about the timing. What would Harlan have done? Cora almost smiled. Harlan would have kept working and let the work speak for itself and driven Vess half mad with how little he reacted. She paused. But Harlan had 40 years on this county. You've got 6 months. Her eyes were steady and a little hard. You're going to have to build in 6 months what he built in 40, which means you can't afford to wait out everything. Some things you're going to have to meet head on. Lydia drove back to the farm thinking about that the whole way. The confrontation with Conrad Vess came sooner than she'd expected and in a form she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't legal. It wasn't a letter or a phone call or a motion. It was Vess himself, in person, in her driveway on a Saturday morning in mid-May. A heavy-set man in his late 60s, driving a truck that cost more than her farm's annual revenue, who got out and walked toward the barn where she was working and stood at the entrance with his hands in his jacket pockets. She had never seen him before. She knew who he was because Silas had pointed him out once, at a distance, in Delwood. You're Lydia Mercer, he said. It wasn't a question. I am. She set down what she was holding, which was a broken trace chain she'd been examining, but she did it without hurrying. He looked at the barn, at the mules in the visible stalls, at the general state of the operation. She couldn't read what he was calculating. I wanted to come in person, he said. I think some things are better said directly. All right? My offer is real, and it's fair, and it's going to be the best offer you receive for that section of land. He was looking at her steadily, and he had the particular confidence of a man who has gotten what he wanted through direct pressure often enough that he believes it is his natural state. The legal process is going to take time and money, and I have more of both than you do. That's not a threat. It's a fact, and I'd rather you have it as a fact than find it out the hard way. She listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, I appreciate you coming in person. He seemed slightly uncertain whether this was agreement or deflection. The offer stands through the end of the month. Patricia Oakes sent you our response yesterday, she said. I don't have anything to add to it. His expression shifted. Not angry exactly, but tighter. Your grandfather was a stubborn man. He was patient, she said. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the mule closest to the barn entrance, which was Trace, who had come to the gate of his stall and was regarding the visitor with his steady, unhurried attention. That your lead animal? Vess said. Yes. He looked at Trace for a moment. Something in his expression that she couldn't classify. Not softness, not quite. More like recognition of something he hadn't expected to see. Then he looked back at her. "You've got more of your grandfather in you than I expected." He walked back to his truck and left without another word. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment after the truck disappeared. Her hands were steady. She checked, because sometimes the hands know things the mind hasn't processed yet. They were steady. "He'll go harder now," she said to Trace, who blinked once and looked away, which was Trace's version of agreement. Silas had been up at the equipment shed when Vess arrived. He came down 20 minutes later and she told him what had happened, word for word, because Silas was the kind of person who needed exact information to give useful responses. "He came himself," Silas said when she'd finished. "Yes." "That's interesting." He thought about it. Men like Vess send lawyers and letters when they're operating from strength. When they come themselves, it's because the lawyers and letters aren't working the way they expected, and they want to read you in person. What did he read? Not what he hoped for, probably. Silas looked toward the road where the truck had gone. "He'll go to the county next. Permitting, like Cora said. He's got relationships there." "I know." "You need to get to the county first." This was not something she had done yet. Not from avoidance, but from focus. The narrow focus of building the operation that had, until now, been the most urgent thing. But Silas was right, and she knew it, and she had known it for 2 weeks, and had been putting it off because she was better at solitary work than at the room. Working that county relationships required. She went to the county planning office on Monday morning. She asked for every permit, every registration, every filing that her operation might require, and she filed them, all of them, that same day, walking from office to office with her notebook and her documents and the particular composure of someone who is being careful rather than confident, which looks different and works better. The permit clerk, a woman in her 50s named Arlene who had clearly seen everything twice and had opinions about all of it, looked at the stack of filings Lydia put on her desk and said, "You starting a business or writing a dissertation?" "Both, probably," Lydia said. Arlene had almost laughed. She stamped the applications and told Lydia the processing timeline and gave her the name of the county agricultural extension agent who handled timber operation registrations, which was a piece of information she hadn't known she needed. She called the extension agent that afternoon. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was 35 and knew his regulations cold, and was, she discovered, one of the people who had been quietly following the progress of the Mercer operation through the county grapevine. "I've heard about the mule logging," he said. "There are some state-level programs for sustainable forestry operations that you may qualify for. They come with certification, and they come with some financial support." He paused. "Most people don't know about them because most people aren't doing what you're doing." She wrote down everything he said. Heartwood Mill's formal agreement arrived in the second week of May. The written contract with Patricia's revisions incorporated. The grain grading criteria specified exactly as she had asked. The first right arrangement covering 4 harvests over 18 months. She signed it at the kitchen table and scanned it and sent it to Patricia, and then sat for a moment with the pen still in her hand. The agreement was real. The operation was real. The upper trail and the spring and the aquifer beneath it were real. 6 months ago she had stood in an auction yard and people had laughed and she had folded a bid slip and put it in her coat pocket. She thought about Harlan writing in the 1994 journal. "What is down there is significant. I am more certain of this than I have been of most things." She thought about a man who had been certain of something for 30 years and had chosen patience over announcement, who had waited not because he lacked urgency, but because he understood that some things can only be proven by doing them, and that the proving takes longer than the knowing. She thought about Cora saying he felt the weight of it, the responsibility of a piece of land that had been protected, partly, by its own difficulty. The upper ridge that had been saved by being too steep for machinery, too inconvenient for the men who might have damaged it. She thought about 15 mules that everyone had called worthless. She put the pen down. She went out to feed the animals because it was that hour, and they were waiting, and the work did not pause for significance. Cora Vance called on a Thursday morning in late May. Lydia was on the east slope and she came down when she felt the phone vibrate, because something about the timing made her pay attention. But it was not Cora on the line. It was a woman who identified herself as Cora's niece, calling from the hospital in the county seat. Lydia drove down the mountain without taking time to change or wash her hands. She sat in a hospital waiting room that smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and old coffee, and she waited, and the niece, a woman in her 40s named Bev, who had Cora's directness but less of her patience, told her that Cora had had a cardiac event the previous evening and that the doctors were cautious about the next 48 hours. She asked for you specifically, Bev said. There was no particular warmth in how she said it, just fact. She woke up this morning, and the first thing she said was to call the Mercer girl. She sat with Cora for an hour that afternoon. Cora was small in the hospital bed in a way that Lydia had not prepared for. She had known Cora primarily as a presence, rather than a person with physical dimensions, a voice and a directness and a memory that went back further than anyone else's. Seeing her reduced to the particular smallness of hospital rooms was a specific kind of hard, but Cora was awake, and she was herself, which was to say she was direct. Don't make a face, Cora said. I'm 83, not dead. You told me you didn't know your age. I know it fine, I just don't see why other people need to. She looked at Lydia with the familiar steady attention. Tell me what's happening with Vess, Lydia told her. The rejected offer, the procedural challenge, the in-person visit, the county filings. Cora listened. You went to the county yourself. Monday. Good. She was quiet for a moment. Harlan should have done that sooner. He trusted the work to speak, and mostly it did, but there were years it would have helped to have the relationships in place. She looked at the ceiling. He knew it too. He was better with land than with people. I'm not sure I'm better, Lydia said. You're different, Cora said. Different is enough. She turned her head on the pillow to look at Lydia directly. I have something for you. It's in the house. Bev knows where. A box on the shelf in the back room, marked with an H. She paused. Harlan left it with me 20 years ago. He said to give it to whoever came to work the property, and meant it. She paused again. He told me what to look for. Told me I'd know when I found the right person. Lydia was very still. What's in the box? I don't know exactly. I never opened it. Cora looked at her. But he said it was the last piece, the part that made the rest of it make sense. The room was quiet, except for the soft machine sounds that hospital rooms accumulate. Lydia looked at the woman in the bed, 83 years old, small and sharp and still entirely herself, holding a piece of a story that a man named Harlan had entrusted to her 2 decades before. Cora, she said, he trusted you with this for 20 years. He trusted me with a lot of things, Cora said. That's what you do with people you trust. You give them the things that matter, and you let them hold it. She closed her eyes for a moment, not from weakness, but from something that looked more like resolution. Go get the box. Bev led her to the back room without conversation, which suited Lydia fine. The house was the kind of house that accumulates a life rather than decorates one. Shelves that held what was useful and what was remembered without distinguishing between the two. A ceramic mug with a chipped handle next to a photograph. A folded piece of paper next to a seed catalog 20 years old. Lydia looked at none of it directly. It felt like reading someone's mail. The box was on the 3rd shelf, marked with a single letter H in black marker on masking tape. Harlan's handwriting, the same careful, cramped hand from 41 composition notebooks. It was a shoebox, old, the cardboard softened at the corners with age. Bev pointed at it and left without being asked, which was the most considerate thing she did that day. Lydia carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. She did not open it immediately. She was aware of the particular quality of the moment, not drama exactly, but the weight of sequence, the feeling that what was in the box was the last word of a sentence that had started 32 years ago when Harlan Mercer walked the upper trail and pressed his hand above a well cap and wrote down what he believed. She was aware that she was about to finish reading something a man had started writing before she was old enough to understand what land meant. She opened it. Inside was a folded topographical map, hand annotated, more detailed than anything she had found in the surveys or the journals. Every trail marked, every stone marker, every drainage line, and in the upper right section of the map, the 12 acres, the spring, the ridge, a notation that was different from the rest. Where everything else was written in pencil, this was written in ink. Full formation. Northeast quadrant. Depth estimate 200 to 240 foot. access point marked, and an X placed with the precision of a man who had been to the spot enough times that his hand went there without measuring. Beneath the map was a letter. Not the same letter as the cedar chest, a different one, shorter, written on plain paper without legal formality. The date at the top was November of the previous year, 6 weeks before Harlan died. She read it once quickly, and then a second time slowly, the way she had learned to read his things. If you are reading this, you found the cedar chest first, and then you found Cora, which means you did it right. The map shows you the access point I identified, the northeast quadrant of the spring formation. I hired the hydrologist to confirm what I already believed, and he confirmed it, and then I paid him and put his report in the envelope because I was not ready for anyone else to know. I have thought a long time about what this water means, and I keep coming back to the same answer. It is not mine. It was never mine. It belongs to the land and to whoever is willing to be responsible to the land rather than for it. There is a difference. I spent 40 years learning that difference. I hope you didn't take as long. There is one more thing. In 1988, I registered a conservation easement on the Upper Ridge section with the State Land Trust. It covers the spring formation and 100 feet in every direction. Whatever is there cannot be developed commercially. It can be accessed, it can be assessed, it can be used sustainably. The terms are in the land trust documents, which the trust has copies of. I did this because I knew that whoever found it would be tempted, and temptation is easier to resist when the decision has already been made for you. I'm sorry I didn't tell you in person. I meant to have more time. She sat with the letter for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, the county road carried occasional traffic in the particular rhythm of a Saturday. Not busy, not silent, the ordinary pulse of a small county going about its business. She thought about a man sitting down to write this letter in November, knowing the calendar was running out, choosing what to say and what to leave for the box and what to leave for the trail itself. He had registered the conservation easement in 1988, 35 years ago. Before the hydrologist, before the deed correction, before any of the documents in the cedar chest. He had made the irreversible decision first and built the rest around it. He had removed the commercial temptation because he knew what commercial temptation did to good judgment, and he had made the removal permanent so that it couldn't be undone by a bad year or a large offer. Vess's offer, she understood now, had never been about the land. It had been about the water, and the water as of 1988 was already protected. She called Patricia from the car in Cora's driveway. "The Upper Ridge Spring Formation," she said when Patricia picked up. "There's a conservation easement registered with the State Land Trust, 1988. Harlan registered it." A silence. "Patricia." "I'm here. I'm thinking." Another silence, shorter. "If the easement predates Vess's adverse possession claim period, and 1988 does easily, then his claim fails on its face. You can't establish hostile use against a protected formation. And the commercial development angle he's been implying as leverage disappears entirely." Her voice had changed. Not excited exactly, but sharper. "Do you have documentation?" "Harlan said the land trust has copies. I have a letter referencing it." "Get me the land trust name and I'll pull the registration. If this is recorded properly, Vess's entire legal strategy collapses." She paused. "Lydia, this changes the timeline considerably." "I know. His attorneys will know within a week once I file. The procedural challenge becomes pointless and the adverse possession argument is dead. He has no remaining legal angle." She looked out the windshield at Cora's front porch, at the rocker on the porch that was empty and slightly crooked and had the look of something used every morning for years. "What does he have left?" "Pride," Patricia said, "which is sometimes the most expensive thing a man can have." She was right about the timeline. Patricia pulled the land trust registration within 2 days. It was clean, properly recorded, witnessed by the same Asheville attorney who had handled the 1991 deed correction and who had apparently been helping Harlan build this carefully, piece by piece, for decades. The easement covered the spring formation exactly as the letter described. It was, Patricia told her, one of the most comprehensively drafted easements she had seen, with specific language that closed every commercial exploitation angle while preserving the owner's right to access, sustainable use, and water rights for agricultural purposes. "He had a very good attorney," Patricia said. "His daughter is pretty good too," Lydia said,
She filed the easement documentation with the county on a Wednesday morning, the same week Patricia sent Vess's attorney the formal notice of the conservation easement's existence and its implications for all pending claims. She did not hear from Vess directly. She did not expect to. Men like Vess did not call to concede. They simply redirected, and she understood that he had already moved his attention elsewhere, to something more yielding, because that was how men like him operated. They pressed until something gave, and then they moved on to the next thing. The fact that she had not given was, for now, enough. The procedural challenge to the deed recording was dropped the following week without comment. She was at the county clerk's office when the recording was finalized, not because she had to be there, but because she wanted to be. She wanted to watch the clerk stamp the document and log the recording number and set it in the processed stack, the action that translated everything Harlan had built: the journals, the survey, the hydrologist's report, the letter in the cedar chest, the box at Cora's, into something the county officially recognized. The clerk did it with the brisk efficiency of a person who processes dozens of documents a day and has no idea which ones matter. Lydia watched and said nothing and drove home. She stopped at the diner on the way through Delwood and had coffee and a piece of pie she didn't particularly need but ordered anyway, because some things deserve a small acknowledgement. The pie was mediocre. She ate all of it. Cora came home from the hospital on a Friday in early June, thin and deliberate and annoyed at the fuss her niece was making. Lydia brought coffee and sat with her on the porch in the crooked rocker's companion chair and told her everything: the easement, the drop challenge, the deed recorded. Cora listened without interrupting, which meant she had already known most of it. "Bev told me," Cora said, which confirmed it. "Did Harlan tell you about the easement?" Lydia asked. "He told me he had made the decision permanent." Cora looked out at the road. "He didn't give me details. He said some things are better not known specifically because then nobody can be pressured about them." She paused. "He was a careful man." "He was more than careful," Lydia said. "He was strategic." "He was both," Cora said. "Careful men aren't always strategic. Strategic men aren't always careful. He was both at the same time, which is harder than it sounds." She looked at Lydia. "You're starting to be both." "I'm still more careful than strategic." "That's fine. You've got time to even out." She picked up her coffee. "What are you going to do with the spring?" "Marcus Webb, the extension agent. He knows a hydrologist who does assessments for the state conservation programs. I'm going to have the formation assessed properly, updated from Harlan's 2001 survey." She paused. "Within the easement terms. Agricultural water rights for the operation. The animals drink a lot of water." Cora almost laughed, the closest she usually got. "Harlan would say that's exactly right." "The easement also allows for educational access," Lydia said, "which I'm thinking about, long term." She had been thinking about it since she read the letter, tentatively, not yet a plan but a direction. What Silas knows, what the journals document, the mule logging protocol we've built this year. It's not... There are people who would benefit from having access to that knowledge. Younger people trying to do what I'm doing without a Silas Boon to show up at their barn. Cora looked at her for a long moment. "You're thinking about teaching it?" "Eventually, when I understand it well enough." "You understand it better than you think." Silas says the same thing. "Silas has better judgment than he lets on," Cora said. She looked back at the road. A truck went past. Phil Darden's, Lydia recognized it, and Phil raised a hand off the wheel as he passed, which in Clanton County was a full greeting. "The county's talking about you differently than they were," Cora said. "You know that. You told me people were starting to." "I told you they might. Now they are." She set her coffee down. Dale Pruitt told someone at the hardware store that the Mercer girl knew more about working timber than he'd given her credit for. Coming from Dale, that's a public apology. Lydia thought about the auction yard, about the microphone and the laughter and the bid slip in her coat pocket, about driving home with 15 mules in a borrowed trailer on a November morning with $4 left to her name. "It's not an apology," she said, "but it's enough." "It usually is," Cora said. The summer came in hard and fast the way Blue Ridge summers do. Humidity that arrived overnight and settled in like a permanent tenant, the kind of heat that made early morning work a necessity rather than a preference. She was up by 5 every morning by mid-June, the barn work done before 7, the slope work in the cooler morning air before the heat built. The mules had adapted to the rhythm.
The way working animals adapt when the work is consistent and the care is reliable. Not happily exactly, because mules are not primarily concerned with happiness, but with the settled competence of creatures who have found their function. All 15 were working now. This had happened gradually, without ceremony, across the spring, the last 3 holdouts finding their way into the rotation through patient repetition and the particular social pressure that working animals exert on one another. Bristol, who had scared her most in those first weeks, had become one of her most reliable heavy-haul animals. Strong, now predictably tempered, with a steadiness on difficult terrain that she had stopped being surprised by and started relying on. The Heartwood Agreement ran smoothly through its first 3 scheduled harvests. Eugene Greer came out twice more, once in May and once in July. And both times he walked the slopes and asked hard questions and seemed to find the answers acceptable, which from Greer meant they were more than acceptable. He had started telling people about the operation. She understood through the supply chain, not loudly, not with promotion, but in the quiet professional way that men with 27 years of reputation protect that reputation by being selective about what they associate it with. 2 furniture makers had contacted her directly, one from Virginia, one from North Carolina, both wanting to know if they could source material directly, bypassing the mill. She had redirected them to Greer because the arrangement she had made was the arrangement she intended to honor, and because Greer's expertise in grading and certification added value. She couldn't provide herself, and because she had learned from Harlan's journals and from Silas and from 6 months of mountain work that the temptation to cut out the middleman was usually the temptation to carry more than you were ready to carry. She turned down the Virginia furniture maker politely and the North Carolina one less politely when he called a second time and implied that her arrangement with Heartwood was limiting her revenue potential. She told him her arrangement with Heartwood was her business and he could contact Patricia Oakes if he had questions about it. She told Silas about the second call on a hot July morning while they were working the north slope of the property, a section she had been preparing for the fall harvest. He listened and then shrugged with the particular economy of a man who considered the outcome obvious. "You did right," he said. "I know. I'm just confirming it. I know that too." She was marking a red oak, measuring the diameter at breast height, recording it in her notebook. "Silas, when did you know it was going to work?" He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. He was looking up the slope toward the ridge, in the direction of the upper trail. "March," he said. "When you came down that slope after the mud freeze and the first haul was done and you didn't say anything about it, you just fed the animals and went inside." He paused. "People who are putting on a show can't help saying something when something goes right. You didn't say anything." She thought about that. "I wasn't putting on a show." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." The conversation she had been putting off with Dale Pruitt happened in late July, when she brought Trace and 4 others to his lower slopes for the first contracted day of work. She had held the terms she had told Silas she would hold, her protocol, her marking, her timetable. And Pruitt had accepted them with less resistance than she had expected, which told her Cora had been right about the mud season and what it had shifted. He met her at the access gate in the morning and walked with her to the first haul site, and he was quiet in a way she hadn't expected from him. Watchful, actually observant, not performing competence but genuinely trying to understand what she was doing. "You marked these trees yourself?" he asked, looking at the selection marks on the timber she had walked with him 2 weeks earlier. "Yes. Silas walked it with me after." "He change any of your marks?" "2. He looked at the marked trees. "Which ones?" She showed him. He looked at the 2 alternate marks, the ones Silas had proposed, and the original marks she had set, and he was quiet for a moment. "The ones Silas changed," he said. "What was your reasoning on the originals?" She told him. He listened. He looked at both options again. "Your reasoning wasn't wrong," he said. "It was just shorter term than his." "Yes," she said. "That's what he told me." Dale Pruitt looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not warm exactly, but was genuine, which was worth more. "I was wrong about you," he said. "At the auction. I said what I said, and I was wrong." She could have been gracious about it. She considered it. "You were doing what made sense from what you could see," she said. "You couldn't see what I was looking at." "What were you looking at?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. Harlan's journals, she said, and 15 animals that everyone had decided were worthless because they were inconvenient. She paused. It's easy to decide something is worthless when it doesn't fit the way you're already working. He received this without defending himself. That was when she knew he was listening for real. My boy wants to know about the mule logging, he said after a moment. He's 22. He's been watching what you're doing. Tell him to come by any Saturday morning, she said. We start at 7. The day rate for the Pruitt work was the financial bridge that got her through the summer and into fall planning. Combined with the third Heartwood payment, she closed the August books for the first time without doing the math 3 times to make sure she had it right. She did it once. It was right. She put the legal pad down and sat with the numbers for a minute in the way she had learned to receive good news, quietly, without inflation, because good news inflated too easily, and the drop when it deflated was worse than the original problem. Then she went to feed the mules. She walked the upper trail in early September, for the 3rd time, the first twice having been reconnaissance, this time with the hydrologist Marcus Webb had connected her to. His name was Thomas Reardon, and he was systematic and thorough and used equipment she didn't fully understand to measure what was beneath the well cap. He spent 3 hours on the ridge. He took samples. He made calculations in a notebook she couldn't read over his shoulder because his handwriting was medical in its illegibility. At the end, he told her what she already believed, which was confirmation rather than news. The aquifer was substantial, clean, and stable. The pressure readings were consistent with a formation that had been sealed and undisturbed for decades. The water quality, from the preliminary samples, exceeded every standard he was accustomed to measuring. Your grandfather's hydrologist was accurate, Reardon said. If anything, he was conservative. Harlan said the same thing, she said. He said the man was good but cautious. Reardon looked at the well cap and the stone collar and the ridge above them with the particular expression of a professional who has assessed many things and found most of them ordinary. This was not ordinary, and she could see him knowing it. Within your easement terms, you could establish a gravity-fed water system to the farm structures. Livestock watering, irrigation for any agricultural use. No commercial extraction, which the easement prohibits, but the agricultural application is permitted and significant. He paused. You could also apply to the state conservation program for a heritage water designation. It won't change the use terms, but it adds formal protection, and it comes with some financial recognition for stewardship. Marcus Webb mentioned that. Marcus Webb is good at his job, Reardon said. She started the water system planning that fall, working with a local contractor who had done similar gravity-fed systems in the county, and who looked at the ridge elevation and the property layout and said, with the confidence of someone who had done this enough to be bored by it, that it was straightforward work, not cheap, not fast, but straightforward. She was not in a hurry. Cora died in October. It came with the particular cruelty of deaths that follow a recovery. Cora had come home from the hospital and been herself again for 4 months, sharp and dry and present. And then on an early October morning, her heart decided it had made its last concession, and that was the end of it. Bev called Lydia before she called the county, which Lydia learned later and which told her something she hadn't known about Bev. She sat with it for a day before she did anything else. She told Silas, and he went quiet in his way and looked out at the ridge for a long moment, and then said, "She was a good woman," which was the entire eulogy he was going to give, and which was sufficient because it was true, and he meant it. She went through the week after Cora's death doing what she always did, the animals, the slopes, the notebooks, the phone calls, because that was what Cora would have considered appropriate, and because there was no version of grief that excused her from the responsibility of 15 animals who didn't understand it. At the small service in Delwood, she sat in the back and listened to Bev speak about her aunt with an awkward love that Bev couldn't quite make smooth, but that was clearly real. And she thought about a woman who had held a box for 20 years and watched a piece of land wait for the right person and never opened the box because Harlan had asked her not to, and some people are built with that kind of fidelity. She thought about fidelity, about what it cost, about who paid it and who received it, and whether the receiving was ever as heavy as the giving. She thought it probably was, just differently weighted. After the service, standing in the small yard of the Delwood Church, in the particular gray light of an October midday, Dale Pruitt came to stand beside her. He didn't say much. He said he was sorry about Cora, and she said she was too, and they stood for a moment in the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable but is honest, which is rarer than it should be between people who started wrong. My boy showed up Saturday, Dale said. He did. He's good with the animals. He's better than I was at his age. There was no pride in how he said it, just fact, and something quieter than fact underneath it. He wants to come back. He's welcome, she said. Dale nodded. He looked at the sky. I've got another 2 landowners who've asked me about your operation, whether you'd take on additional contracted work. She had been thinking about this for 2 months, about the line between enough and too much, the line Harlan had been warning her about obliquely in journal entries that talked about other men who had found something good and then expanded it until they killed the thing that made it good. She had been very aware of that line, checking for it regularly, asking herself whether the pace was still consistent with the principles or whether it was starting to run ahead of them. I'll talk to them, she said. But slowly, on my terms. She paused. The operation doesn't scale the way a conventional business scales. That's not a weakness. It's the point. If I take on too much too fast, the work suffers and the timber suffers, and the whole thing becomes what everyone said it was going to be anyway. Dale looked at her. What did everyone say it was going to be? A mistake. He was quiet for a moment. Some things only look like mistakes from far away, he said. Up close, they look like decisions. He extended his hand. Happy to tell anyone who asks that you know what you're doing. She shook it. I know some of it, she said. I'm working on the rest. November arrived, the 1 year, though she didn't count it that way, didn't circle it in a calendar or treat it as a finish line, because she had understood early that the year condition in Harlan's will was not a finish line but a starting gate. The year was the proof of intent, nothing more. The actual work had no projected end. She went to the auction yard in Delwood on the first Saturday of November, not to buy anything. She was there because the Clanton County Agricultural Extension Office had asked her to speak for 15 minutes at the pre-auction educational session they ran quarterly, something Marcus Webb had organized, and which she had agreed to because Marcus had asked and because she had told herself she would say yes to the things that cost her something small in exchange for something that might matter. She stood at the front of a room of about 30 people, farmers, a few young people she didn't know, and in the back row, with the expression of a man who had not expected to be there but had come anyway, Dale Pruitt's 22-year-old son. She talked about selective logging, about what Mules could access that machinery couldn't, about the difference between harvesting timber and managing a forest, about the fact that what she had learned in 12 months was the outline of what needed to be learned, and that the outline had been written 40 years earlier by a man who had been careful enough to leave it where the right person could find it. She did not talk about vests or the auction or the laughter or the $450 bills. Those were parts of the story that were hers to keep. She talked about the mules specifically, about what it had meant to take 15 animals that a county had collectively decided were worthless and find out that the county had been wrong. Not because the animals were secretly exceptional, because they were exactly what they appeared to be. And what they appeared to be was genuinely useful, and the failure had been in the looking rather than the looking at. People decide what something is worth based on what they currently know how to use, she said. When the knowledge changes, the value changes. The thing itself was always the same. She paused. That's true for animals. It's true for land. It's probably true for more things than we tend to admit. Afterward, 3 people came up to ask questions. One of them was a woman in her 30s who had just inherited a property in the adjacent county and was trying to understand what her options were. Lydia talked with her for 20 minutes. She gave her Marcus Webb's number and Patricia Oakes's number and the title of the first book she had found actually useful in those early November weeks before Silas showed up. She did not tell the woman it was going to be easy. She did not tell her it was going to work. She told her what she knew, which was that the work was the thing, and the work was longer than the plan, and the only way through the gap between them was to stay. She drove back to the farm in the November afternoon light, thin and angled, the same quality it had been 1 year before when Silas walked into her pasture for the first time and told her Trace had been waiting for her to figure something out. The ridge was bare-limbed against the sky. The leaves were mostly down, the mountain's bones visible in the way they only are from November through March, the skeleton that the green months hide. She pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. The operation was real. The deed was recorded. The spring was protected. The agreement with Heartwood was into its second phase. Silas came 3 mornings a week now, instead of 5, because 3 mornings a week was what was necessary, which meant something about how far she had come. The mules were in the pasture and the barn, and all 15 were alive and working and fed. She thought about Harlan writing in a composition notebook in 1994. I am more certain of this than I have been of most things. She thought about what it meant to be that certain about something you couldn't yet prove, to be certain enough to wait 30 years for the proof to walk up your driveway. She thought about the kind of faith that isn't religious but is still absolute, the faith in a process, in a patience, in the stubborn conviction that the right work done the right way eventually becomes undeniable. She thought about Cora in the hospital bed saying, "Go get the box," with her eyes already closing again. She thought about 15 mules in a borrowed trailer on a November morning, tired and thin and recalibrating to new ground. She got out of the truck. She walked to the pasture fence. Trace was at the near edge, where he usually was at this hour. Attentive, unhurried, watching her come across the yard with the steady focus of an animal who has decided you are worth paying attention to. She leaned on the fence and looked at him. "Same time tomorrow," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and walked back into the pasture, where the others were, where the light was going down in the particular way it goes down in the mountains, fast and then sudden and then done. And she watched until she couldn't see him clearly anymore. Then she went inside and started the propane stove and put the kettle on and opened the 41st composition notebook, the last one, the one from the final year, the one she had been saving without admitting she was saving it. She turned to the first page.